For decades, numerous accusations have been made against German soldiers of the Wehrmacht. Some are true and well documented, but others have been exaggerated, manipulated, or outright invented. Many assume, for example, that all German soldiers were fanatical Nazis, when in reality most were not even members of the party. Another popular myth is that the German army was a modern, fully motorized force during Operation Barbarossa, which is false. A significant part of its logistics relied on horses. It has also been claimed that soldiers rolled up their sleeves before executing civilians, as if it were a symbolic gesture of cruelty. Although photos exist showing this, in most cases it was simply due to heat or for practical work. These myths, repeated in films, documentaries, and social media, distort the facts and oversimplify a far more complex reality. Myth 1. Were all German soldiers fanatical Nazis? Many believe that all German army combatants thought like the party leaders. But secret audio recordings made by British intelligence reveal a different picture. On hidden microphones, most soldiers spoke like ordinary men without repeating political slogans. They were not ideologically selected soldiers, but rather parts of a vast war machine enlisted by order or pressure. During recordings in prisoner of war camps, officers and recruits described their daily lives, their fears, their desire to survive, and their interest in food, sex, and returning home. They did not speak like fervent believers. They did not repeat party phrases. They didn't even discuss Hitler as a moral guide. The majority had not joined the Nazi party. Many entered the army before it existed or without caring about it. Some wanted to escape unemployment. Others saw it as a job, not as a political crusade. What was heard on the microphones were jokes, complaints, and stories among comrades. Very few showed genuine enthusiasm for the regime. Those who truly believed usually came from the SS, not the regular army. Those units were steeped in propaganda, trained with racist books and loyalty rituals. But the Wehrmacht was different. It was the traditional military body, which existed even before Nazism. Its discipline came from the state, not the party. The prisoners spoke freely because they didn't know they were being recorded. There were no filters or scripts. They said what they truly thought. That's why these recordings are worth more than any official speech. They show that many did not fully understand why they were fighting. They simply obeyed orders, sought advancement, or just wanted to survive. Some admired Hitler, but without truly knowing what he was doing. Others quietly hated him. What mattered to them was their squad, their group, their comrades. Ideology was distant from the mud, bullets, and cold. What drove the soldiers was habit, fear, and duty ingrained from youth. War seemed normal to them, just part of the job. They were so immersed in it that they didn't stop to question whether it was just or not. They simply carried out their duties. Their actions seemed logical within that context. Even when many committed crimes, they didn't see them as ideological acts, but as part of combat, tasks they were assigned. British interrogations also showed that soldiers told jokes about the party, criticized their superiors, doubted victory and decisions from Berlin. They were not automatons. They were men caught in a system that had swallowed them without asking for their consent. Not all were innocent. Many participated in massacres, especially in the East, but that didn't make them ideological believers. They acted out of habit, fear, and peer pressure. On battlefields, politics wasn't discussed. Instead, they talked about food, women, cigarettes, the Russians, and making it home alive. The idea that they were all fanatics does not match what is heard in these recordings. Fanatics were a minority. Most were ordinary soldiers, raised in a country already controlled by the regime but without political passion. They were cogs in a system that used them until the very end. Myth 2. Rolled up sleeves to kill? What those rolled-up sleeves really meant. Many remember how German and Soviet soldiers looked during the war on the Eastern Front. In photos, Germans are often seen with rolled-up sleeves in hot weather, while Soviets are not. For decades, this image was interpreted as a sign of danger. In occupied regions like Serbia, Belarus, or Ukraine, civilians believed that when Germans rolled up their sleeves, it meant they were about to launch a raid or execute prisoners. This idea was repeated in testimonies, films, and war reports. But the real explanation is simpler and lies in the fabric of the uniform. German soldiers wore clothing made from wool blended with viscose. The same material was used in their undergarments. It was thick, warm, and designed to withstand European winters. But when summer arrived on the Eastern Front and temperatures rose to 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, wearing this clothing became unbearable. Many soldiers sweated constantly, suffered dizziness and itching. The clothes stuck to their bodies and made movement difficult. Therefore, military command issued an order allowing soldiers to roll up their sleeves during hot days. Rules were even established on how to do it properly to maintain the uniform's overall appearance. In contrast, Soviet soldiers wore cotton uniforms. The fabric was lighter, more breathable, and generated less body heat. This made rolling up sleeves unnecessary in the same conditions. That's why, in combat photos, it's very rare to see Red Army soldiers with rolled-up sleeves. The difference wasn't ideological or tactical, it was technical and practical. Heat was felt differently depending on the uniform. That's why Germans needed to roll up their sleeves and Soviets did not. Nevertheless, this difference led to a widespread misinterpretation for years. In some occupied regions, civilians claimed to have seen German soldiers take off their jackets, roll up their sleeves, and line up just before executions began. This sequence became etched in memory as an image of fear. People began to associate rolling up sleeves with the onset of violence. Although no military rule linked this gesture to killings, the repetition of similar scenes eventually solidified the myth. In the collective memory, seeing a soldier with rolled-up sleeves was enough to believe something terrible was about to happen. But most of the time, rolling up sleeves had nothing to do with executions. Soldiers did it to work better, digging trenches, standing guard, or enduring the sun. Sometimes they did it to clean weapons, read maps, or write reports. It was a practical gesture like opening a window or removing a scarf. The problem is that in war, ordinary actions can take on darker meanings. Habit and fear turned normal gestures into symbols. That's what happened with the sleeves. A simple uniform adjustment became a death warning. The High Command's decision to allow soldiers to roll up their sleeves is documented in internal orders and technical regulations. Visual instructions were even distributed on how to fold the fabric correctly so that everyone maintained a neat appearance. The German army cared deeply about appearance, but amid heat, mud, and battle, comfort took precedence. Soldiers preferred to lighten their clothing for better mobility. And although this action had no violent intent, many interpreted it as a direct threat. Contemporary photographs reinforce this difference. In images from the Eastern Front, it's common to see Germans with sleeves rolled up to the elbows, while Soviets wear theirs fully down. The explanation again lies in the fabric. Cotton breathes better, wool suffocates. That was the technical reason. But what remained in civilians' minds was something else. For them, the gesture became a warning signal, and so a myth was born, one that is still repeated today, unaware that it all started because of the damn heat. Myth 3, to the last breath, what they did before surrendering. As the Eastern Front collapsed and Reich soldiers fled westward, civilians were left trapped in the midst of disaster. Many escaped out of fear of the Soviets. Others hid underground or in fields. Villages emptied within hours and roads filled with carts, elderly people, children, and pregnant women. But behind this retreat, violence also advanced. Defeated and out-of-control German troops entered private homes, looted, abused, and murdered with no orders and no punishment. In cities like Breslau, Berlin, or Königsberg, before the Russians arrived, German army units devastated everything they encountered. They burned documents but also stole jewelry, food, and alcohol. Some raped German women, many of them refugees. They beat them, cut them with razors, and locked them in basements. The SS were not the only ones involved. Regular soldiers and members of the Volkssturm also participated. They exploited the chaos to do whatever they wanted. No one was in command anymore. There were no officers left, only fear and hatred. In many eastern towns, the final days of German occupation were a nightmare. In Neisse, Reich soldiers locked an entire family inside a farmhouse and set it on fire. In another area, a mother was tied to a post while her daughters were raped. Then they were executed. The retreat was not only military, it was also a wave of crime, rage, and desperation. Every time they pulled back, they destroyed roads, bridges, and train stations. They took children to use as decoys or shot them so the Russians wouldn't capture them alive. In Silesia, the violence turned inward. Many army men executed deserters. They hanged them with signs reading "traitor," leaving their bodies at crossroads to spread terror. Some were teenagers, drafted in January. Others were tied to electric poles and shot in the face. The streets of small towns became mass graves. No one buried the dead, no one mourned. They just walked past and kept marching, as if no soul remained in the country. The army that claimed to fight with honor ended up murdering its own people. In Pomerania, German troops blocked entire villages, took the remaining women and brought them to empty barns. There they forced them to lie on straw and raped them one by one. Some were girls, others were pregnant, then they shot them in the head or slit their throats. In many rural areas, the retreat was even worse than the invasion. They left behind German blood spilled along the roads. The enemy hadn't even arrived, yet terror had already erupted from within. The war was devouring its own soldiers. In Bavaria and Austria, officers feared peasant uprisings, so they sent units to monitor villages. But those same patrols began killing civilians who tried to hide food or escape forced conscription. In more than one village, Germans opened fire on columns of refugees emerging from the forest. They used machine guns, threw grenades, and then covered the corpses with blankets or snow. They claimed they were Russian spies. In reality, they were elderly people from their own region fleeing hunger and bombs. The enemy was inside their own uniforms. The final phase of the war was the end of the mask. There was no more propaganda, no cameras, no marches, only fear, blood, and destruction. The army that had marched toward Moscow with military bands returned by trampling over the bodies of its own people. Soldiers who had sworn loyalty to Hitler became unleashed animals. They killed each other over a coat. They stole each other's boots. They left wounded comrades to die in the cold. If someone fell, they used him as a shield or finished him off. In that hell, military honor had been lost long ago. Myth 4, just cannon fodder. The real tactics of the Red Army. For years, it was repeated that the Red Army won by hurling masses of unarmed soldiers against enemy trenches, that their generals used their men's lives like stones, that they advanced in lines one after another while NKVD officers aimed from behind to prevent retreats. This image spread through books, films, and even Western documentaries, but the truth is different. From the beginning of the war, Soviet commanders applied methods combining speed, massive artillery, and synchronized movements. When the Germans attacked in June 1941, the Soviets responded disorganized and without clear plans. But that didn't last long. In less than 6 months, they began to adapt. They used attrition tactics, learned to ambush and exploit terrain. By late 1942, they were launching offensives that combined armored divisions, sappers, and air cover. The goal was always to break the front at a weak point and then encircle the enemy, not to advance in senseless human waves. This idea was part of German propaganda to justify their defeats. Most Red Army attacks were planned weeks in advance. Trains, mobilized artillery pieces, tanks, ammunition, and reserves. Spies gathered terrain intelligence. Enemy lines were analyzed. Before the attack, massive bombardments involving thousands of cannons were launched. Then shock troops advanced, followed by armored vehicles, and later regular infantry. Each step had a purpose. It wasn't about pushing bodies until the enemy trench was emptied. The strategy was to create gaps, cut communications, and leave German divisions isolated and without supplies. It's true that human losses were extremely high. But this wasn't because Stalin sacrificed men without thought. It was because the war against the Wehrmacht was brutal, and the Germans defended every inch as if it were Berlin. The Nazi war machine was designed for precision destruction. Any frontal offensive, no matter how tactical, meant losing thousands of lives. The Soviets knew this. That's why every attack included air support, heavy tanks, and a logistical plan to maintain pressure. These were not blind attacks. They were complex operations. Soviet commanders also learned from their mistakes. The defeats of 1941 and 1942 were used to reorganize command, purge incompetent officers, and improve coordination. Artillery schools were created, training centers for armored commanders were established, and new doctrines emerged that used speed as a weapon. The Germans were shocked at Kursk and during Operation Bagration. They thought the Soviets only knew how to advance in straight lines. But they saw how their own forces were surrounded, their supply depots destroyed, and their escape routes cut off. That was the key to victory. Soviet assault units were not unarmed masses. They used light machine guns, grenade launchers, portable anti-tank weapons and mines. In some cases, they even carried flamethrowers. They advanced under smoke cover or after chained bombardments. Some crossed frozen rivers wearing animal skin life vests. Others broke through enemy lines using armored tractors or skis. Every operation combined ingenuity, strength, and preparation. The Red Army didn't win by pushing bodies to the front. It won by adapting, enduring, and using everything at its disposal to break the enemy. The myth of human waves was useful for many. For the Nazis, it justified their downfall. For the Allies, it explained the Soviet advance without acknowledging their real effort. For those who feared communism, it portrayed the Red Army as a soulless machine. But internal documents, maps, and memoirs of Soviet commanders show otherwise, that behind every advance there was strategy, numbers, and precision. And that victory came at a high cost, but not blindly. It was learned, corrected, and carried out with every resource available. Myth 5. An invincible elite. The truth behind the black uniform during the war, Nazi propaganda portrayed the Waffen SS as Germany's toughest, bravest, and most loyal force. Films, posters, and speeches depicted them as perfect warriors, wearing black uniforms, swearing direct loyalty oaths to Hitler, and fearless in the face of danger. But in practice, only a few Waffen SS units reached that level of training. Many others were hastily assembled, poorly trained, and composed of foreign volunteers who didn't even speak German. At the beginning, the SS was a small body with no military experience. Its role was to protect Nazi leaders and carry out political tasks. When war broke out, Himmler sought to turn it into a parallel army. To do so, he created the Waffen SS. Using his influence, he secured weapons, uniforms, and recruits. Those who joined were promised better treatment, respect, and a special place in the new Germany. But many of the early members were untrained recruits, lacking discipline and motivation to fight. In battles such as France, the Netherlands, or the USSR, some Waffen SS divisions showed extreme resistance and combat fanaticism. But they also left behind a record filled with war crimes, civilian murders, and summary executions. The Totenkopf division, for example, originated directly from concentration camps. Its training was brutal, its conduct was just as brutal. The Das Reich and Leibstandarte divisions were the most famous, equipped with heavy vehicles, modern weapons, and experienced soldiers. Yet even they committed massacres, such as in Oradour-sur-Glane, where they burned alive women and children. Over the years, the Waffen SS grew without control. Himmler needed more men, so he accepted volunteers from all occupied countries. Croats, Belgians, French, Norwegians, Romanians, and even Bosnians. Many were promised good pay, food, and uniforms. Some fought for ideology, others out of necessity. But results were mixed. These foreign units spoke different languages, had different customs, and did not always obey orders. Some surrendered en masse, others deserted, and many never even reached the front lines. The myth that all Waffen SS members were elite soldiers does not match the historical record. In the final years of the war, new divisions were formed so quickly that recruits received little or no training. Weapons were handed out untested, soldiers didn't know how to use grenades, and basic commands were unfamiliar. In Hungary and Austria, entire units were seen retreating without firing a shot. On the Eastern Front, many were sent as cannon fodder to slow down the Red Army. They died without understanding why they had been sent there. Wehrmacht commanders viewed the Waffen SS with suspicion. They said their discipline was forced, their training poor, and their behavior criminal. But because Himmler had direct access to Hitler, no one could control them. Some SS units were fanatical and fought to the end. Others surrendered en masse when they learned the enemy was British or American to avoid capture by the Soviets. This showed that not all were willing to die for the Reich, as propaganda claimed. The idea that the Waffen SS was the spearhead of the German army served the regime's narrative. It allowed the Nazis to project a powerful, youthful, and pure image in contrast to the older, traditional Wehrmacht officers. But this image collapsed over time. By the end of the war, there were over 30 Waffen SS divisions. Only a few had professional standards. The rest were improvised militias, some made up of teenagers, others of ex-convicts, and many of foreigners who didn't even know why they were there. The black uniform, the helmet, the oath, these were all part of a constructed image. On the battlefield, reality was different. The Waffen SS was not an elite force. It was a mix of fanatics, opportunists, conscripts, and lost souls. Its legacy is marked by brutality, massacres, and blind obedience, not honor or victory. Myth 6. German soldiers behaved like gentlemen in the East. A Russian woman stands in the forest holding her young child when a German soldier approaches. She holds the baby as he asks if it's hers. She answers yes. The man says nothing. Suddenly he snatches the child from her arms and smashes its head against a tree. The body falls to the ground. She screams and cries. He laughs and walks away. Elsewhere in Ukraine, a German squad encounters a group of farmers. They demand bread, eggs, milk. One man refuses to give anything. A non-commissioned officer draws his revolver and shoots him in the face. The others panic and throw everything they have on the ground. The Germans take it all and set the cabin on fire. Further north in Belarus, a woman in her 30s is dragged from her home by two soldiers with black insignia. She screams that she has children, that her husband is in the army. They laugh. They throw her to the ground and grab her together. One holds her arms, the other pulls down her skirt and rapes her. Then they switch places. When they finish, another approaches with a bayonet. He stabs her in the stomach and leaves her lying there. A German colonel wrote in his diary that his men were accustomed to disposing of women after using them. He wrote that it boosted morale and kept them active. In occupied villages, they went from house to house. Young women were marked. They were taken to barns or sheds. Sometimes several men used them. They were released if they were lucky. If they cried or resisted, they were stabbed. A priest from Lviv said soldiers with machine guns entered his parish. They looted everything: wine, bread, clothes, watches. Then they raped the nuns. One was over 70 years old. They broke her ribs, and she died 3 days later. Another had her habit torn off and was paraded naked through the streets. A group of Wehrmacht soldiers wrote in their letters that they enjoyed watching Ukrainian women hide whenever their trucks appeared. One soldier said that if they found a pretty one, they'd take her and return her later, if anything was left. Another said they once took turns with 3 women, like in a brothel, but without paying. On trains heading to the front, soldiers played games to see who could report the most rapes. Some spoke of collecting Russians. One claimed his record was 8 in one night. Another wrote that he tied a woman to a bed and set the cabin on fire. He said she screamed like a madwoman. In Lithuania, a girl was impaled on a stake by a group of drunk soldiers. They claimed she was a spy. They tied her to a pole and drove the stake through her from below. She bled to death. No one asked questions. In Poland, troops used civilians for target practice. They made men stand and shot them in the legs. If they fell to their knees, they were shot in the head. Sometimes they made pregnant women stand and bet on whether the bullet would exit through the back or remain inside. In a village near Minsk, they entered a school and pulled out the children. They asked if they knew how to pray. If any said yes, they hanged him. One asked to see his mother. They threw a grenade into his lap. Officers knew what their men were doing. Some encouraged it. They said it hardened the soldiers, that it accustomed them to terror, that it made them better in battle. Others took photos and sent them home. Some show naked women in the mud, surrounded by laughing soldiers. Others show dead children with signs on their chests. One reads, "Little Red." In concentration camps, guards who came from the Eastern Front were the cruelest. They knew how to torture. They knew how to humiliate. They had seen so much that they felt nothing. A prisoner said those were the ones who beat without stopping. When someone fell, they kept beating until he no longer moved. All of this happened before the Soviets counterattacked, before Stalingrad, when the Germans were advancing, when they felt invincible, when they believed no one could stop them. These scenes repeated every day, everywhere. Always with the same coldness, always with the same laughter. Myth 7. The Soviets treated prisoners well in the spring of 1950. The Soviets released more than 90,000 German prisoners of war who were still alive. Some were so weak they could barely move. These men were transported across border points in Saxony or Brandenburg. Many carried skin parasites, had open sores, or infections that reeked of decay. Several had lost teeth, fingers, or had bones deformed from untreated injuries. They wore no shoes and had no proper clothing. Almost all had forgotten how to write, how to use cutlery, or how to greet someone. Their return sparked no celebration. Families received a letter stating the date and time of the crossing, but authorities forbade any reception with flags or music. In some cities, relatives weren't even allowed to approach the station. Upon arrival, the returning men were first taken to medical centers or military stations, where they were disinfected, shaved, and given a grey, unmarked uniform. Some received new documents. Many lost their real names as records contained errors or false identification numbers. Once back in their towns, most found their homes gone, destroyed by bombing or confiscated. Many relatives had died or moved away. Neighbors looked at them with suspicion. Some turned their backs, blaming them for having worn Hitler's uniform. In other places, they were accused of being Eastern spies. Several were forced to register with the police or the local party office. Some ended up living in stables or cellars. Many took their own lives shortly after returning. Factories and workshops refused to hire them. They were asked for documents they didn't have or required to prove they had been prisoners. Others were told it was too late. Positions were already filled. Many worked as day laborers or cleaners, paid in food. Those who secured permanent jobs did so without contracts. Authorities refused to grant pensions, claiming that serving as a soldier in the East didn't count as labor service. Others had their insurance cancelled due to years of absence. The state offered no psychological support. Those who suffered nightmares, screamed at night, or wet the bed ended up in psychiatric institutions. Some received electric shocks. Others were treated as dangerous lunatics. In certain cases, doctors themselves reported them to the police. There were instances where former prisoners were imprisoned for antisocial behavior. No one asked what they had been through in the camps. No one cared how long they had been chained up or how many had died before their eyes. In the media, their story was erased. Newspapers spoke of reconstruction, the economic miracle, and the new Germany. Talking about the past became taboo. The few books that mentioned the prisoners did so only in passing. In schools, the children of these men were taught that Germany lost because of fanatical soldiers. Many changed their surnames or invented stories to hide where they came from. In the mid-1950s, several of these former prisoners formed support groups. They met in parishes, homes, or bars. Some printed bulletins with testimonies. Others compiled lists of the missing. They tried to get official recognition from the government. They submitted petitions, organized marches, and sent letters to Parliament. But most politicians remained silent. They feared that discussing prisoners of war would damage the image they wanted to project to the world. Only in 1955, with Chancellor Adenauer's visit to Moscow, did the issue become public. Germany negotiated the release of the last captives. Upon his return, Adenauer was applauded. But for those who returned afterward, nothing changed. There was no compensation, no official apology, no ceremony. They received only a train ticket and a cold meal ration. Years passed. Many of them aged without family, home, or name. Some died in shelters. Others ended up in hospitals without identification. Several never managed to speak about what they had endured. In certain neighborhoods, they were still called the Russians because of where they had been held. On their gravestones, the reason for their long absence was almost never recorded, only a return date written in cheap ink. Myth 8, German discipline was perfect. One of the most repeated stories about German troops during the war is that they were a model of order, control, and total obedience. But secret recordings of captured soldiers reveal a completely different reality. Many spoke freely about how they ignored orders or did whatever they pleased when superiors weren't around. The officers' authority still carried weight, but it didn't stop many from acting on their own if they thought they could get away with it. There were soldiers who stole, others who shirked duties, and some who even exploited the chaos to abuse their positions. The image of a flawless, rigid, and perfect military unit does not match the real accounts of those who were there. In many units, hierarchy was respected only if the commander demonstrated real authority, and when he didn't, respect quickly collapsed. There were also frank discussions about internal punishments. Beatings among comrades for disciplinary reasons were common, as were physical punishments from officers trying to enforce obedience by force. Pressure among soldiers was immense, and more than one described how a group could isolate or punish anyone who failed to meet their expectations. Violence didn't come only from the enemy, it also came from within their own ranks. Drunk episodes, loss of control, and disobedience were part of daily life in many battalions. Although regulations were strict and punishments for indiscipline could be extreme, enforcement was inconsistent. Some officers turned a blind eye if they needed the men, while others punished harshly to set an example, even when unnecessary. There was no single way of maintaining order, and this chaos was evident in the soldiers' own descriptions. One prisoner explained that the constant threat of punishment kept many in line, but fear didn't always work. Sometimes exhaustion, fatigue, or hatred pushed soldiers to break the rules, and if the situation allowed it, they did so without hesitation. The most feared punishment was execution for desertion, yet it didn't stop many from fleeing or faking illness. Even among better-trained soldiers, like young officers, there were cases of insubordination, lack of discipline, or abandonment of duty. Psychological pressure also took its toll. Some soldiers panicked, froze, or became paralyzed during combat, and their comrades saw this as betrayal. Not all were emotionless machines. Discipline existed, but it was full of gaps, exceptions, and contradictions. Fear of punishment was real, but so was the exhaustion and anger they carried inside. The image of the German soldier as a perfect example of blind obedience collapses when you hear their own voices describing what truly happened. Myth 9. German women also killed. They worked in command offices, ran homes for officials, served as nurses in ghettos, and even served in the SS as armed secretaries. Some ran camps and made decisions, others pulled the trigger. One such woman was Johanna Altvater, known to witnesses as the Angel of Death. She accompanied officers on village inspections, speaking calmly to Jews, then suddenly shooting children in the face. She once pushed a child out of a second-floor window, and she wasn't alone. Many women acted with the same coldness without being forced. There's also the case of Hildegard Lechert, who worked as a guard at concentration camps like Majdanek and Ravensbrück. She beat prisoners, left them bleeding, or set dogs on them. After the war, she was arrested by the Soviets and later by the Poles. She was eventually sentenced for her brutality. Most of these women were not isolated monsters acting outside the system. Their actions fit perfectly into the occupation plan. The regime sent them as part of its racial cleansing and colonization effort. They were teachers, nurses, bureaucrats' wives, medical assistants, but upon arriving in Ukraine or Poland, they transformed. Some looted Jewish homes, others helped register people for deportation, some volunteered for special tasks with security forces. Many of these crimes were committed willingly. No one forced them to go, but they accepted. Often young, single women with personal ambitions and convinced by Nazi ideology. Some did it to impress their partners, others for adventure, but many knew exactly what they were doing. Wendy Lower documented over a dozen direct cases and estimated that the total number of women involved in the East could exceed 500,000. The image of the typical German housewife vanishes completely. Many participated in executions, guarded lines of Jews heading to trains, or collaborated with Gestapo leaders. The idea that they didn't know or were just following orders doesn't hold up to scrutiny. They were there. They were trained. They knew what they were doing. Some acted with enthusiasm, others learned quickly. What's clear is that they were not mere bystanders. Myth 10. The immaculate uniform of German soldiers, pressed clothes, polished boots, and every button in place. This appearance has become part of the myth of the most organized army of the war, an image constantly reinforced by propaganda and cinema. But the reality at the front was very different, especially as combat dragged on and supplies failed to arrive. From the first year of the invasion of the Soviet Union, soldiers faced rain, mud, extreme cold, scorching heat, and long marches that destroyed their clothing. The original uniforms, designed to look sharp in parades, quickly became torn, stained, patched, and were often replaced with garments that had nothing to do with regulations. In many cases, soldiers swapped their official coats for wool sweaters obtained from civilian homes or sent from Germany. Some wore hand-knitted caps from their mothers, women's scarves, second-hand gloves, or even enemy clothing. Contemporary testimonies show that uniforms lost their practical importance. In trenches and during long marches, the only priorities were staying warm, protecting the feet, and avoiding freezing to death. Socks stayed wet for days without drying, boots wore out quickly and weren't always replaced. Instead, some wore Russian peasant footwear or makeshift boots made from scraps of leather or rubber. Divisions fighting in the east, especially during the winters of 1941 and 1942, suffered from a lack of proper uniforms. The army was unprepared for temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius. Many soldiers were forced to wear anything they could find, even women's coats, civilian wool caps, or captured Red Army clothing. Archival photos show German soldiers with unbuttoned jackets, dirty trousers, mismatched gloves, and hats that bore no resemblance to regulation design. Insignia disappeared, patches faded from use, and no one had the time or conditions to wash or iron clothes. Contemporary magazines tried to preserve the image of the ideal soldier, but the gap between that image and reality grew enormous. Instead of clean, shining uniforms, what one sees on the battlefield are figures covered in mud, with cracked hands and tattered clothes. Hygiene became a serious issue. Soldiers went weeks without bathing, and a mix of sweat, blood, and grime soaked every layer of fabric. The smell in the trenches was unbearable. Lice became part of daily life, just like foot blisters and frostbite on ears. The discipline of uniform appearance became a distant idea. Survival was what mattered. And in that daily struggle, elegant parade uniforms turned into a jumble of borrowed, worn-out, shapeless clothing. The myth of the neat, pristine German soldier collapses in the face of the mud, cold, and brutality of the Eastern Front. Myth 11. The silent executioner, that Germans attacked without making a sound, German soldiers marching with cold calculation and iron discipline, showing no emotion during combat. This image has been reinforced for years by audiovisual portrayals that contrast Third Reich troops with their Soviet opponents, known for their collective war cry, the famous Ura. However, this perception is far from the documented reality of combat. Authentic recordings of conversations between captured German soldiers, secretly recorded by the British and Americans during World War II, reveal that shouts, exclamations, and noise were a constant part of the German combat environment. Raised voices served not only to communicate orders or warnings, but also to channel fear, stress, and excitement during engagements. Many soldiers reported that during assaults they let out various shouts, some improvised, others born purely from the moment's impulse. Instead of a standardized, institutionalized cry like the Soviets, Germans made sounds that reflected their emotional state or immediate tactical needs. The volume, intensity, and frequency of these shouts varied depending on the situation, type of combat, and unit composition. In shock operations, such as attacks on fortified positions, soldiers often shouted to disorient the enemy, coordinate with each other, or as an involuntary reaction to extreme danger. The book Soldaten, which meticulously analyzes the actual behavior of German combatants based on these hidden recordings, makes it clear that the typical soldier was not a silent automaton. Testimonies reveal that moments of direct contact with the enemy were loud, chaotic, and filled with intense emotion. Many prisoners described naturally how they shouted, cursed, or simply yelled reflexively during battle. Some used insults against the enemy, others expressed fear or adrenaline, and many did it to boost their own morale. All of this disproves the myth of the impassive German attacker advancing in silence. There were also differences between units. While elite sections maintained greater verbal restraint as part of their training, others, especially regular infantry or battalions on the Eastern Front, acted with fewer restrictions. Constant exposure to fear and combat pressure reduced emotional control. Even officers understood that shouting could be a natural psychological release. Therefore, the image of German soldiers as silent executioners is not only a fictional product, it contradicts the empirical evidence documented by the Allies themselves. The war, as these men lived it, did not unfold in silence. Myth 12. The myth of modern equipment. In films and video games, every German soldier is shown wielding an MP-40 submachine gun as if it were the standard-issue weapon. This perception, however, severely distorts the logistical reality of the Third Reich's army. In truth, the equipment of German frontline troops was far from this popular image, especially in standard infantry units. The MP-40 submachine gun, Maschinenpistole 40, was indeed part of the German arsenal, but its presence was far from widespread. Designed as a short-range automatic weapon, its total production did not exceed 1.1 million units during the entire war. This number sharply contrasts with the more than 14 million Mauser Karabiner 98K rifles distributed widely among German troops. The Mauser, a bolt-action rifle, was the standard weapon for infantry soldiers in both the Wehrmacht and auxiliary divisions. Its range, accuracy, and durability made it the basic combat tool, even in grueling campaigns like those on the Eastern Front. The MP40 was generally reserved for specific roles. It was commonly seen in the hands of non-commissioned officers, squad leaders, or soldiers assigned to urban combat or assault units. In a 10-man squad, only one or two would have access to this type of weapon. Its use was more tactical than standard. Close-quarters combat or trench assaults justified its deployment, but its high rate of fire and rapid ammunition consumption limited its usefulness in prolonged engagements. In open terrain or extended battles, the military preference remained with the Mauser, which allowed better ammunition conservation and greater range. Moreover, MP40 production required a more complex industrial effort. Although an improvement over the MP38, its construction relied on molded metal parts and precise assembly processes. In contrast, the Mauser 98K had standardized production lines dating back to World War I. This difference in manufacturing ease also influenced its widespread use. The MP40 became above all a propaganda symbol. Its distinctive silhouette appeared in official documentaries, posters, and wartime films, helping to build the image of the modern, fast, aggressive German soldier. In practice, this image applied more to specialized units like Panzergrenadiere or the Waffen SS than to the average soldier deployed in Stalingrad or the Ardennes forests. Even within the SS, whose logistical priority was often higher than that of the regular Wehrmacht, access to modern submachine guns was not universal. As George H. Stein's research clarifies, many divisions formed in the war's second half lacked the promised weapons. Soldiers assigned to replacement units or territorial defense divisions received reserve arms, sometimes not even automatic. This reinforces the gap between the MP40's image as the emblem of German infantry and the reality of an army that, until the end, continued to rely on a bolt-action rifle designed decades earlier. Thus, the myth of widespread modern equipment, and especially the idea that every soldier carried an MP40, falls apart when reviewing actual production figures, distribution patterns, and military doctrine. What appears as a symbol of technological superiority turns out in most cases to be a visual exception elevated to a rule by post-war cinema. Myth 14. Hugo Boss as the designer of the SS uniforms. It has been widely claimed that Hugo Boss designed the black uniforms of the SS and left his aesthetic mark on the entire Nazi military apparatus. This image has taken root in popular culture to such an extent that many still believe the fashion brand was the creative mind behind one of the most feared outfits of World War II. However, historical documents and official records paint a different picture. The true origin of the SS uniform design lies with Karl Diebitsch, a graphic artist who also held the rank of officer within the organization. Together with Walter Heck, a member of the SA, Diebitsch defined the shape and details of the uniforms later worn by the regime's most radical units. This team designed the black cap with the skull insignia, the collared jacket with emblems, and the dark uniform with the double lightning bolt symbol, elements that would become central to Nazi visual identity. The blueprints, concepts, and aesthetics were developed internally within the party structure, with no creative input from outside companies. Hugo Ferdinand Boss, owner of the textile firm bearing his name, played a different role in this system. His factory did not propose designs or set styles. Its function was to fulfill orders. From the early years of the Third Reich, Boss received contracts to manufacture military garments for various branches, including the SA, the SS, and the Hitler Youth. His role was strictly that of a supplier, like many other workshops of the era that similarly carried out state-commissioned production. Economic archives and post-war reports indicate that Boss's company grew significantly due to these military contracts and even used forced labor in the final years of the war. This direct involvement in the Nazi textile apparatus led the company to face legal consequences after the war. However, no creative responsibility for the uniform's appearance was ever attributed to Boss. The confusion arises from the coincidence of his name with the notorious visibility of the SS uniforms. Historians have clarified that Nazi military aesthetics were conceived from within as a tool of visual propaganda appealing to order, strength, and intimidation. Diebitsch, who also designed logos and emblems for the SS, worked directly with Himmler to define the symbolic elements of the force. Decisions about fabrics, colors, and cuts were driven by ideological goals, not commercial ones. Therefore, the myth of Hugo Boss as the official designer of SS uniforms lacks historical foundation. His company did participate in the mass production of military clothing, but the ideas, style, and symbolism were the product of party officials themselves. The persistence of this myth seems to stem more from the name's familiarity and the brand's later fame than from documented facts. Myth 15. The German army was fully motorized during Operation Barbarossa. Of the 3 million soldiers who launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, fewer than 500,000 belonged to motorized divisions. Infantry divisions marched long distances, carrying their own equipment or relying on mules. Artillery, supplies, and heavy equipment were pulled by animals. Trucks were scarce and reserved for specific missions. In total, the Wehrmacht deployed over 600,000 horses in the Eastern Campaign. The ratio of animals per soldier was higher than in World War I. Even in elite units like the 1st Panzer Division, part of the supply chain relied on traditional means. This caused constant delays and difficulties in delivering fuel, weapons, and food to the front. Many battles were lost due to an inability to move ammunition. There were cases where soldiers fired only a few rounds per day because animals couldn't haul crates to their positions. Across large sections of the front, roads were unpaved, turned to mud during rains, or froze solid, trapping vehicles. Horses, though slower, could still advance through the mud. Images of tank columns or motorized units crossing Russian fields show only a tiny fraction of the reality. In fact, even within armored divisions, some units advanced on foot. The rest of the army, especially reserve or support divisions, didn't even have motorcycles. Mobility was so low that advances often progressed at the pace of a march, lasting for weeks. The belief that the entire German army advanced in trucks or tanks comes from film and propaganda. In reality, the war in the East was fought by exhausted men with broken boots, following animals pulling wooden carts. That was the true backbone of the Wehrmacht. Myth 16. Cold was the only factor that defeated the German army. German military command believed the conquest of Moscow could be completed before winter arrived. When the offensive began in October, everyone was convinced that only one final push was needed. But Soviet resistance halted the advance. Autumn rains destroyed the roads, trucks got stuck, troops couldn't move forward. The German army weakened with each passing day. Units were at their limit. Spare parts didn't arrive. There were no fresh soldiers to replace the fallen. The Soviet push from the east forced the offensive to stop. It wasn't the cold that destroyed the German army, it was exhaustion. They had marched thousands of kilometers without rest. Supply lines failed, trains couldn't keep up, horses died from fatigue. Weapons ran out of ammunition, divisions were shattered, officers and medics were missing. There was no hot food, no replacement uniforms. Clothing was rotting, boots were broken, casualties grew every week. By October, they were no longer countable. Each advancing column grew thinner. High command tried to reorganize the lines, but it was too late. The enemy surrounded them. The terrain turned into a swamp. Artillery couldn't advance. Aircraft couldn't take off due to fog. When temperatures dropped, they were already trapped. The cold merely delivered the final blow to an already broken force. The Soviets exploited the chaos. They attacked the flanks, cut supply routes, recaptured towns, deployed fresh divisions, reorganized their tanks, and pushed forward with everything they had. The German retreat was chaotic. Many soldiers were left behind. Some froze to death. Others were captured. But what destroyed the army was its lack of organization. They had underestimated the enemy. They believed the Soviets would surrender. But that didn't happen. Moscow held. Stalin mobilized the entire population. Factories kept producing. Trains arrived full of reinforcements. Morale remained high. To say it was only the cold is to hide the truth. The disaster had begun long before. The mistakes were German. Winter arrived after they had already lost their advantage. Commanders miscalculated distances and had no clear plan if the attack failed. And it did. The collapse came from within. The weather was just the final slap. Myth 17. The SS divisions were composed only of pure Aryans. In the early years, the Waffen SS did seek soldiers of Germanic descent, especially to form its elite corps. At first, they rejected anyone who did not come directly from the Reich, and the recruitment process included medical checks, family background reviews, skull measurements, and other racist pseudo-scientific tests imposed by Himmler. But this policy lasted only a short time. As the war expanded and the fronts began to consume thousands of men per month, those rules were quickly abandoned. The SS could no longer afford to reject recruits based on race. Starting in 1941, entire foreign units were incorporated. They recruited anyone available: Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians, White Russians, Ukrainians, Bosnian Muslims, Croats, Hungarians, Slovaks, French, Flemish, Spaniards, Norwegians, Danes, and even Indians, Arabs, and Albanians. Entire divisions were formed, such as the Handschar Division, composed of Muslim volunteers from the Balkans, or the Viking Division, which mixed Scandinavians, Dutch, and Belgians. Some Waffen SS divisions were composed almost entirely of foreign volunteers. By 1944, more than 60% of the troops serving in the Waffen SS had been born outside of Germany. Many were conscripted by force. Others volunteered to avoid being sent to labor camps to protect their villages from the advancing Red Army, or simply out of hunger. There were also common criminals, opportunists, and collaborators at all levels. The idea that all were fanatical German Nazis is completely false. This myth of Aryan purity within the SS collapses at the mere sight of division names and their origins. Nazi propaganda concealed this reality, and after the war many preferred to keep repeating the lie to preserve the image of an honorable army. But archives, battalion rosters, and operational reports tell a different story. The SS was a hybrid, diverse force, largely non-German. It was the furthest thing from an exclusive squadron of pure Aryans. Myth 18. All soldiers moved in motorized vehicles. The Germans mastered coordinated attacks, combining aircraft and tanks to break through Soviet defenses from within. This style of warfare gave them a major advantage in the early months of the conflict. The problem arose when this fast-moving tactic required infantry to arrive quickly to close the encirclement. That's where everything started to fall apart. Although they advanced with force, the majority of German soldiers moved on foot or on horseback, and this slowed them down. During the Soviet counter-offensive known as Operation Bagration in 1944, the Red Army deployed thousands of trucks supplied by the United States under the Lend-Lease Agreement. With these vehicles, they maximized their advances. In contrast, the Germans had very few of their own trucks. Many were of poor quality or lacked spare parts. As an alternative, they relied on animal-drawn carts. This caused entire Soviet units to escape early in the conflict because the Germans couldn't quickly close the gap between their fast-moving tanks and the infantry advancing on foot behind them. This delay also affected how the Germans transported ammunition, fuel, and food to the front. Rail lines across Soviet territory covered only a few areas. Moreover, cross-country roads were poor or completely impassable. To solve this, supply columns pulled by horses became the most reliable way to move goods. Many Germans celebrated when they captured enemy trucks, as their own vehicles were insufficient for their needs. Therefore, dependence on horse-drawn transport was not just a minor detail, it was clear evidence that the German army was not as advanced as it appeared. Compared to the British, Americans, or even the late-war Soviets, the German mobility system seemed outdated and bogged down. This weakness explains why they lost momentum when they needed to sustain offensives over time. With fuel shortages, limited industrial capacity, and supply blockades, High Command had few options. Relying on horses was not a choice for them, it was the only possible solution. Myth 19. German soldiers did not know about the Holocaust. In secret interrogations conducted by the British and Americans with captured German soldiers, direct confessions were recorded. Some described mass shootings. Others recounted how civilians were rounded up, executed, or locked away to die. One soldier said that 2,000 people were shot in the Białowieża forest. Another mentioned a trench where prisoners were machine-gunned one by one. Testimonies speak of soldiers who watched, commented, or even assisted. A Wehrmacht officer reported witnessing executions carried out by the SS. Another said he saw a truck full of Jewish children on their way to death. One more recalled soldiers looting victims' belongings before burying them. Many knew what was happening with the trains. At Polish railway stations, troops saw sealed freight cars packed with Jewish families. They heard screams, saw bodies, and discussed among themselves which camp the trains were heading to. Some mentioned Treblinka, others Auschwitz. No one believed they would return. Even in letters home, details emerged. One soldier wrote that thousands of Jews had been killed. Another described how a unit shot women holding children in their arms. Coup de grace shots and piled-up bodies were also mentioned. There was disgust, but also resignation or even support. Some considered it part of their duty. Soldiers knew people were being executed for being Jewish. They understood it wasn't for crimes, but for their origin. They saw men separated, women humiliated, and children thrown away like trash. One said they were ordered to shoot a line of people walking toward a mass grave. Another recalled crying but pulling the trigger anyway. The evidence shows that the front and the rear were connected. Soldiers were not isolated witnesses. They were part of the system. Many saw, heard, or participated. The subsequent silence was a deliberate choice, not ignorance. Myth 20. German snipers were all professionals, unlike the Red Army, which had already developed organized, systematic programs in the 1930s to train snipers. The Germans treated sniping as a secondary role during peacetime and only began taking it seriously after witnessing the effectiveness of Soviet snipers on the Eastern Front. During the early campaigns in Poland and Western Europe, the rapid advance of the German army left little room for sniper use. It was only in later years, when the conflict became more static and defensive, that the German High Command decided to develop this capability. In 1943, specialized sniper training became institutionalized. Experienced marksmen were pulled from the front lines to train new recruits selected from the best infantry soldiers. The Waffen SS also showed interest in the specialty but faced obstacles due to a shortage of proper equipment. The German philosophy emphasized extreme precision, camouflage, and battlefield autonomy. Some snipers, like Matthias Hetzenauer, achieved remarkable records, over 300 confirmed kills, but these were exceptions. Not all German snipers reached that level. The widespread use of German snipers responded to concrete tactical needs. In defensive situations where resources were limited and mobility low, their role became crucial in halting enemy advances, targeting command lines, or disrupting enemy units. However, the selection and training of these soldiers only became standardized after observing Soviet tactics. Even then, organizational differences between divisions and the lack of a unified doctrine led to significant variations in training quality. The reality is that many German snipers were regular soldiers repurposed for the role, not necessarily professionals trained from the beginning of the war. While some proved highly effective, the system as a whole was not based on pre-war systematic training. Therefore, the myth that all were elite professionals stems more from amplified propaganda or post-war narratives than from the actual structure of the German army at the time.